Welcome to our next panel today, and this one is all about, so we're kind of switching, as you'll see, throughout the day between, I think, more of a focus on AI and then back to more of a focus on data itself. So in this one, we're going to be looking at improving how government uses data to make better decisions, and I think we're going to talk about things like, is it kind of the systems, the cultures, the people, the infrastructure? What is it that's working well? What needs to be improved in terms of the way we use data really to get those insights that are going to drive better decision making? We have our largest panel of the day so far and a fantastic set of speakers here. So I'm going to do the same thing, introduce our speakers, ask each of them kind of a question to set the scene from their organisation's perspective, and then throw it open to all of you. So, very quickly as I run through our panel, we've got Sue Bateman, who is the Chief Data Officer at the Department for Environment, Food and Agriculture. I'm also conscious everything's changing so fast with machinery of government and titles, so if I get any of it wrong, do tell me. We've got Pooja Miles, who is the works at the Clinical Practice Research Data Link on safety and in the Safety and Surveillance Group in the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. That's the longest title we have had so far. Then many of you who are here from the start this morning will already have heard from Neil, but those who weren't here, we've got Neil McIver, who's Head of Data for Public Services at with our Platinum sponsor, which is eSynergy today. We've got Christopher Pope, who is Head of Data and Research at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. So great to have not just the civil service, but looking out to local and regional government as well. And Ben Henshaw, who is a Deputy Director at the Number 10 Data Centre. Is that right?
Close enough. Yeah.
Yes, at the centre, sitting at the centre in Number 10. So great set of speakers with us here today. Sue, I'm going to kick off very sort of general question with you really, which is you're now sat kind of heading up all things data within a department. So can you tell us from a departmental point of view what's going well and maybe where could you see some improvements in terms of using data?
Yeah, so it's been a big move over the last 5 months. I've moved from spending several years working in the centre, in the Central Digital and Data Office, and putting in place a lot of the cross-government strategies and frameworks, and then now in a department implementing them. And DEFRA as an organisation, I know there are a couple of colleagues from DEFRA here today, it really is a broad and complex range of things that we need to deliver. So thinking about data for better decision making in the context of DEFRA is quite broad, ranging from monitoring and almost in a regulatory role, delivering services, defining new policies that underpin those services, and also a really broad theme around science and research and kind of that, a blend also then of quite short-term work that we do to meet and kind of continue to progress ministerial priorities, and some very long-term things, particularly in that kind of environmental space. So I'm the first Chief Data Officer into the organisation. There's loads of activity, there's loads of kind of understanding around data and information, because we've purposefully started thinking about data and information as one, especially given conversations just earlier around AI and Gen AI. And so the task for me is really harnessing that and starting to bring together where we've got lots of agencies, lots of big programs, and start to unlock and bring together that data for better decision making. So we're, last thing I'll say by way of intro is we're developing a roadmap to try and bring that together that will focus on strategy, leadership across the organisation, setting those core foundations that we want everybody to build out, and then a really important thing around community and engagement as well.
Thanks. I didn't realise you were the first CDO, so does that in itself show that this is becoming increasingly kind of prioritised?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks. And Pooja, so tell us a little bit about kind of where you sit in the agency and what you do, and then a bit about how data's being used and what are the changes that you've seen over the last few months and years.
Sure, Siobhan. And for context, so the MHRA
remit is to regulate medical products across the UK. And within the MHRA, there is the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, or CPRD, and this is a real-world data research service that then I head up. And what we do in that is we are getting data on a daily basis from a sample of practices across the UK, so a sample of GP practices, over 2,500 GP practices, that is coming in. Then we anonymize the data and we make it available within a robust data governance framework for research that benefits public health. But also, this data is used in, week in and week out to monitor the safety of medicines, medical products. So, I mean, that is such a fantastic thing. If you want to focus on some of the positives, CPRD in some shape or form has been around for 35 years, and we have about 30% and nearly 30% population coverage, which really helps with these decisions. And the public health research, for example, I was told recently, it was used to work out the allocations of how much different GP practices should get based on what is their workload. It's been used by NICE, which of course decides which medicines and interventions should be introduced in the NHS. So it's been used to inform those decisions. So there's a lot of good stuff that's happening.
And would you say there have been some big changes recently in the way data's being used?
The big change, of course, it started when, in about 2017, we started having discussions. Right, these data have been used for ages, but should we allow the use of these data for machine learning? Is it safe? Is it trustworthy? What about patient privacy? So in 2017, one of my first tasks was I led 2 workshops of, with experts to look at these questions and how do we deal with the data governance. And that then allowed us to open up the data for what I'd say is responsible machine learning applications. Because, you can't, yes, when new things happen, it is scary, but you can't hide from them. It's about how can I promote innovation in a responsible way, give public and patients the assurance that their data is being used safely. So I'd say that is the biggest change.
Thanks. And you mentioned they're scary. I think we might come on to in the questions that kind of trust issue and the fear maybe that some people have around how data is being used. Thanks, Pooja. Neil, I'm going to come to you. So building on kind of what you said in your opening remarks, it's interesting. You've sat both within the civil service and now you're sitting kind of outside looking in. Just wonder really your reflections on some of the common issues that you found around data sharing. Again, what's working well, what's not working so well?
Thank you. And I'm not sure if it's gamekeeper turned poacher or poacher turned gamekeeper. I've got to reflect on that yet. The title of this panel presentation is Improving How Government Uses Data, but I just want to zoom out a bit and talk about data usage, because I think that's where some of the challenges are. And again, because I'm a simple person, I talk in threes. I think there's 3 different types of data usage. There's analytical usage, what I talked about earlier about understanding what's working, very focusing on policy departments. There's your operational usage, so, are your job centres running properly and efficiently and effectively? And then there's your transactional, citizen-facing digital service usage. And think about those as a Venn diagram. There are differences between each, but there are also similarities and co-join in the middle. And I think one of the challenges that I often see in lots of different government departments and outside government as well, to be honest, is that those 3 usages tend to be sort of separated and done in silos, but they all rely on each other. So there was a really great example I saw when we were part of exiting from the European Union. Actually, I'm not a civil servant anymore. I'll call it Brexit. We weren't allowed to at the time. But during Brexit, where the Home Office, some of you might remember, the Home Office needed a transactional citizen-facing digital service that would allow EU nationals the right to remain in the UK. And part of that was they had to have worked in certain businesses within the UK during that. And as the digital teams built a really good citizen-facing service, they were thinking about, well, how can we verify some of the information that we are being told by the citizens? Well, hey, over in DWP, they had a longitudinal data set, which I happened to build in 2004, and so it's running, which linked DWP data to HMRC data for analytical purposes. It was a static transaction, a static data set used for analytical purposes. But you know what? It held every job that everybody who paid national insurance had got in the country. So what the clever Home Office digital team did is that they linked to the static analytical data source in real time using APIs, so that when European National went in and said, I've worked for this company, this company, this company, ping across, and very basically, it was a lot more technical than this, it actually says, yeah, we sort of agree with that there or thereabouts, and we took them through a particular conversation in the digital service. Or if we couldn't find the ping, rather than say, no, you're lying, because obviously they're not, because they were giving us their stuff, we actually says, oh, right, could you just supply us with a little bit of documentary evidence? And what that did is it took the friction out of the digital service by not asking for documentary evidence all the time. And government over here knew something about you, so let's capitalise on that information. And then if we couldn't see that, well, let's take it in a different conversation. And then the very final thing I would say, and I have to say this as well, because when I set up the data function in DFE, I managed to acquire the data protection team from being a singleton advisory post in the legal department to a team of 20 people under my command as Chief Data Officer, is let's not hide behind UK GDPR. GDPR doesn't stop you doing anything. It makes you stop and think to enable you to do something properly. So if you ever get, and I always say this sort of half-jokingly, but not really jokingly, if I ever get a data protection officer say to me, you can't do something because of data protection, I'll probably say, well, you're not a very good data protection officer then, are you? Go away and think about how we can do it legally, safely and properly, because it doesn't stop you doing anything.
It's really, I mean, the example that you gave there of kind of linking up those two big data sets raises in me, as a policy person, not a tech, so many, and the first thing I thought is, how could you possibly share that data? You know, because I was told so much about GDPR and you can't share data, and I think
most
there's this legacy of kind of...
is there for legitimate purpose.
Yeah.
It's not done through consent. There are areas which is done through consent.
Yeah.
Legitimate purposes is the use. And also, you've got to think about, you know, if you collect something for the purpose of Secretary of State for Education, the Secretary of State for Education also has collective responsibility to run HM government as part of Cabinet. So one of his legitimate purposes is to run the government. And so you could utilise that if you're a little bit creative to get rid of some of these
I guess then it raises questions about
perceptions.
permissions, what you are allowed to share, transparency, and kind of the quality of that data.
Well, that's why you have to turn to a can-do attitude from your lawyers and your data protection colleagues to a can't-do attitude to a can-do attitude, but let's think about it carefully.
Thanks, Neil. Chris, coming on to you. So the interesting to hear from you about what's happening in the Greater Manchester area, and are there any specific challenges do you think that you face sitting outside government, and are there any challenges between sharing information between central government maybe and local government?
Well, I think there's both. Yeah, I'm going to sit on the fence and say yes, there's both. It's not just one or the other. So as a combined authority, we kind of sit a little bit closer to kind of local areas, to local people, and kind of understand perhaps some of the more the intricate nature of some of the kind of complexities of people's lives than perhaps central government might with its kind of view. But simultaneously, we're kind of closer to the kind of the government side of understanding more processes and kind of the macro picture as well. And as a result, we do kind of need access to information from both sides, I'd say, from central government, from other parts of the local authority and local public sector as well, to be able to make those better decisions, to enable better policy making at a local level as well. And I think when you look at local authorities in particular, the way they work, I quite like a lot of talk this morning about the kind of the mission-based government. The local authorities and local public sector have kind of worked in a slightly mission-centred approach for years anyway, because the way they work is they take these threads of policy, of regulation, of funding and responsibility down, and they try to weave that kind of that local tapestry of solutions that are going to work for local residents, for local businesses. So they have to work across kind of silos. They're going to get pots of funding from lots of different areas and try to use that to kind of for the best ability. And CAs are a little bit like that. Combined authorities are a little bit like that as well. And so we do need access to that information as I suppose a golden thread through there from central government. But we also need to make sure that there's appropriate information sharing across local authorities as well, because we're there to support all of Greater Manchester, not just single parts of Greater Manchester. You know, I think as was referenced this morning, people don't see borders. They don't go to the border of Manchester City Council and go, oh no, I can't go any further and get a job somewhere else. I have to stay here. They do travel between borders, like Greater Manchester. The majority of people who work there, not in Greater Manchester anymore, down in the Big South. The majority of people who work in Greater Manchester live in Greater Manchester, and the majority of people who live in Greater Manchester work in Greater Manchester, but it's not always the same local authority. So we do need to make sure that there is appropriate information sharing across boundaries in the local authorities and the local public sector. That's going to deliver better services, but it also helps us when we're thinking about devolution, when we're thinking about taking on responsibility. We need to make sure that there's that golden thread of information that's coming down from central government as well, along with powers and responsibilities. But also that we're weaving in that local picture as well, we're sharing that information. We do try to, I'll perhaps talk about a couple of projects in a bit, but I think one consistent element along there is culture, and it's good to hear kind of Neil and others talk about this. Culture is incredibly important. There is at times, sometimes a risk averseness, and we talk about kind of moving from more of a risk averse to a more risk informed culture. But there's even, and that's not just between organisations, that's sometimes even within teams. So we're doing a lot of work with our information and data governance teams across local authorities to ensure that we have a kind of a single framework for information sharing. We've got better tools and guidance, and we're going to come up with, hopefully, the more consistent answers to, can we share this information? Can we use this for this purpose? Rather than sometimes slightly more, I don't know whether we can do that.
Yeah, I just want to come in on that point because that's really interesting. I mean, I wonder if I send a challenge out to the audience here. In your organisations, how many of you have a risk appetite statement signed off at board level? Because that's how you address the risk averseness problem, a data risk appetite statement. So in DFE I managed to do it, and it's not a single one, isn't it? So we had an eager appetite for sharing aggregate data, going to a cautious appetite for everything with personal information and all the rest of it. But to address cultural risk averseness needs to be led and supported from the top, and you can only do that with predefined risk appetite statements for your organisation, and that gives the boundaries that every member of staff working for your organisation knows where the challenge is.
Not necessarily organisationally, but we've created an information strategy for all of Greater Manchester that the local authorities, combined authority, basically our GM family, Greater Manchester family, so I'll use GM a lot here, I do apologise. Our Greater Manchester family has signed up to, and that includes that kind of focus on shifting towards a more risk-informed culture.
Great, fab. I mean, I've got lots of questions. I hope the audience have, but it just struck me as well when you were saying that you're closer to kind of the public, you're closer to citizens. You must have loads of data as well that could be really useful the other way.
Yeah. Yes and no. So there are obviously, local authorities provide more services than combined authorities do. They have the responsibility, they have the kind of statutory responsibility. But we do try to access the information that's going to be useful at a pan-GM level, where a pan-Greater Manchester level, talking acronyms a lot, at the pan-Greater Manchester level, so that we can actually inform better policy or better delivery and share that information. So yes, and I think that's part of our offer to government as well. We've got a lot of information that can help you. Maybe you can help us with standards, with culture, with accessing information that you may have that we don't.
Thanks. Okay, Ben, before we come to the audience for questions, can you give us a little flavour of what it is you do in number 10, because you sit in number 10, is that right? And how you're already using data to kind of drive better decision making?
Yeah, sure. So I do three main things. We have a team in the Cabinet Office working with the Missions Delivery Unit, so we run the analysis for that. So that's all those different 5 missions. They have a number of cabinet committees, and we produce lots of glitzy data and models for that. Second, we work with the number 10 policy unit, so that's where if you of the team sit inside number 10 to help them with policy forecasting. So if you're trying to work out sort of how much money should the Treasury and number 10 agree to give the NHS, what's the right model to do that with? And then finally, we do public sector reform. So I'll give you kind of a random example, but just because it's kind of top of mind and it's in the public domain. In the cabinet reshuffle, so the cabinet reshuffle typically happened as a kind of 17th century style process where people write names on literal scraps of paper, they blue tack them to the wall, and private office came to us and said maybe this isn't the way we should kind of do it in 2024. So has anyone played Football Manager before? Yeah, okay, a few enlightened people in the audience. It's a great game. You get a lot of KPIs, and you try and navigate your team to a successful season of victory. So we thought, how can we make the cabinet reshuffle process incredibly data-informed? And how can we make sure that the PM and his closest or her closest advisors are able to understand kind of the relative merits when they're trying to decide which minister to put into each role, and also just show things like gender at an aggregate level and kind of various other things. And so that led to a JavaScript touchscreen app that we built. And there's an Institute for Government report on this if you want to look at that in more detail. But also kind of more system-based stuff around how do you do like genuine prevention and how do you build good models for that. Can I just say a really quick point on Neil's data thing, which is, if you don't know it, the New Zealand information model is really amazing. So basically they have an information commissioner's office, which is all about bullying people into sharing more data rather than stressing people out when they accidentally share data. And kind of like Neil's plea, we have outrageously good job security in the public sector, and I think we can leverage that to be quite risky when we do share data. Like, it's extremely unlikely that you will ever be fired or even disciplined if you do get data sharing a bit wrong. And so, like, the onus really is on us to just share data. I will stop there.
No, really interesting. So it's really interesting that I think that with the 5 missions, they're so broad that the amount of data you must be trying to bring together.
Yeah, we've got about 1,230 data sets at the moment we've
wow,
done.
Quite impressive. And I mean, I used to sit in Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet reshuffle was always done on a whiteboard with post-it notes. So it's quite interesting for me to hear it's now done on kind of an app, a Dream Team app.
It's a digital whiteboard now, so it's a giant screen.
Okay, interesting.
It's a bit like that, but yeah, touch
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have here, as you can see, a wealth of experience and expertise. I mean, we're cutting across so many different kind of policy areas. Who would like to kick off with the first question? Yes, we have a lady down here, and then gentleman here, and then another lady here. So we've got 3 questions at the front. So I think it's that lady first, then you second, and then we'll come to you third. But let's take the first question first. Thank you.
Thank you. This is on. So the first question I have, and one of the things I see when we're trying to do things with data, is how do you tackle the issue of data quality? Because you're kind of, taking data, lots of disparate data sets, and to get meaningful stuff out of it, the data needs to be, accurate and good to use. Yeah. So how do you tackle data quality?
Thank you. I think people got very excited about your question there, in the few rows behind you. So how do we tackle the question of data quality? Sue, I haven't heard from you for a while. I'll come back to you on this.
So I think there's 2 things that I will put into the mix to prompt a bit of conversation. So data quality is important in the context of thinking about the reuse of data beyond the original purpose. So in DEFRA, one of the things that we're doing is very much following the cross-government policies around essential shared data assets, around data quality, so that we're kind of building in that consistency. I landed in the organisation, and people who probably day-to-day don't really talk about data much were quoting QFAIR at me, which is one of the acronyms that we go by around thinking about data quality. So it is really important in terms of, lots of people this morning have talked about foundations. It is one of those key foundational things. But I would also say, from a really practical perspective, and we were having this conversation informally, we shouldn't get hung up on aspiring to perfect quality of data if that means that it's impeding us from doing some quick work or impeding action. I think we always need to think about what is good enough for that particular situation, and if it means that we can work with the data assets that we've got and explain the caveats and understand some of the insights that might come out of it. Let's do that rather than thinking that we can't share because we haven't got the quality quite as perfect as we'd like it to.
Thanks. Anyone else like to add on that? Yeah, Neil.
So Sue's seen a little cheeky glint in my eye here because I'm going to be a bit controversial here. Your data quality or the quality you require for your data may be different from the quality someone else requires from the same data set there. So I've been conceptualizing a theory about what I'm calling Schrodinger's data, where data both exists and doesn't exist in the same space. And I've got some talks on that as well. But I think what we've got to be really careful about is that we need to be much more comfortable with working with uncertainty. And one of the aspects about that, and I think this just goes back to the importance of data governance and data management as well, is your metadata. So how comfortable are you with every variable in that data set that this is accurate for the purpose in hand? And you could actually put a risk scoring against that. And if that risk scoring is visible to the end user can use, going back to risk appetite statements, depending on the risk appetite you have for your certain task you have in hand, you choose whether to include that particular element or not. And then very finally, and this goes back to the systems thinking I was talking about in my keynote this morning, is that the best way to get higher quality data is to use data that the inputter needs for their own purposes, because they'll get it right. If you're demanding that someone puts in data in a form for someone else and they don't care if it's right or not, your data quality is going to be absolutely rubbish. So wherever possible, start thinking about, from your perspective, how can I use the data that already exists, maybe in an operational process or a case management system in social care or what have you. Because if they know, the operator, the frontline members of staff knows that data is really important for them to do their job, you will have higher quality data than if they're setting it into a government black hole somewhere and no one really cares what happens to it.
Thanks. Anyone want to add? Yep.
Yeah, I don't think there's any one simple answer. I think we're kind of highlighting there the kind of things around culture, certainly, and kind of people knowing when they're collecting that information that it needs to be good quality. But I think there's an element around standards here that sometimes we assume that you can create a standard and people will follow it. The honest truth is people don't. Like, they don't. And even worse when it's a kind of a top-down standard. It's this is the standard that you have to follow. We've set it out. There you go. And I think at a kind of a local authority level, there's that there's sometimes a reluctance to kind of follow that when, I think has been highlighted already today, we've got legacy systems. We've got ways of outputting that information that we're used to. And so the approach that we've taken in Greater Manchester is to kind of pull together the right people, the people who are kind of collecting that information, make sure they're all in the same room together, and then to develop a data standard that they all agree to. So it's a bottom-up type approach rather than a top-down. I think that's worked quite well for with our planning colleagues. We regularly get our kind of planning colleagues around the table, and we kind of produce a data set that I think prior to 10 years ago wouldn't have been possible in Greater Manchester because they were just kind of, the information was reported in different levels. It's land supply, where development's going to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And we were able to pull that information together from 10 local authorities that I don't think was necessarily possible 10 years ago because we got the right people.
Thanks. I'm going to move on. Pooja, did you want to come in?
Just to say that from a data quality perspective, we do have a data quality strategy. But we took a decision many years ago, and I still stand by that we will not change the data. We will characterize the data. We will publish metadata. And it goes back to Neil's point, because if I make assumptions about what is good and what is relevant, and you are using it for some other purpose. So, for example, should I remove temporary patients from the database? No, you might have a research study where you actually want to look at who are the people who are not in the system. So metadata, data characterization is the way to go.
Thanks. Okay, next question was here.
So in our organisation, we've got it's both a blessing and a curse of an abundance of operational experience.
Which organisation is this?
That's Ministry of Justice. Okay. So there's a lot of decisions historically have relied on operational experience to say, we know that this is true because it was true when I worked in a prison or in a court. And therefore it must be true now. As we're sort of developing data and trying to use data to inform decisions, trying to sort of muscle all that operational experience out of the way and say, actually, whilst that may have been true when you worked in a court 10 years ago, it's not necessarily true now, and here's the data that backs it. The culture of the organisation is to just accept the operational experience as true and then not look at supporting data. So has anyone had any similar challenges and success in being able to sort of bring data more to the forefront of the decision-making process?
Good question around, so to what extent can you use the most current data, I think, to maybe break some of those historical assumptions? Anyone like to answer this one?
I can jump in. So I think the way I would consider doing it is ask your colleagues to quantify their judgments and say, that sounds great, can you tell me what your forecast looks like? And then just track it and see if it does really well. And because it might be the case, right, that you're wrong and they're right, like it might be. And you can kind of validate that and see, and then you can also put your forecast on there based on the data. And over time, I mean, obviously it's quite uncomfortable and it's quite a competitive way of doing it. And you can tell that I've spent far too long working in the centre of government if that was my go-to suggestion. But then the other way is just to actually kind of go and get that operational experience yourself. So something we do a lot when we're doing kind of a report for an advisor is we just go and visit so I went to visit 10 prisons last month. You can probably guess why. It was just so helpful. To be honest, we got everything we needed from the data, but it allowed us to just check a few things, and we were wrong on a couple of things that the visits did really help with validating. And of course, we had lots of people who had worked in prisons before, but that ability to go out into the prisons ourselves meant that we weren't having to accept at face value kind of everything they said that might have been slightly out of date. So kind of a bit of a challenge, but also let's be real, you probably are right. And one way to get that out is to just get them to quantify it.
Neil?
Yeah, really interesting point there, and you've just activated some little grey cells that I had in the back of my mind from one job I had the privilege of having was being the chief statistician at the Department for Work and Pensions. And one thing I would say to you is don't always write off the gut feeling of those frontline staff, because those frontline staff know what's happening. So this example was my team were producing statistics on the number of appeals and which stage of appeal on employment and support allowances a benefit for disabled people. And policy came around straight away. They said, your stats are wrong because you've got a number there and that part of the process doesn't happen because it's not part of the policy. And we're saying, well, we've got a number there because that's what we're pulling from the frontline staff. And what actually happened, to cut a long story short, was frontline staff were actually doing things that weren't policy, which was fine because it was happening, and so we were reporting what's actually happening. But policy never talked to the frontline staff, and we had to be, the statistician in the middle had to be the conduit to get people. So I'm really glad, Ben, that you're going out to prisons, because my permanent secretary at the time ensured every senior civil servant in DBP spent time in a job centre to actually know what was going on and don't hide in your policy, sort of Westminster Whitehall Tower. And what happened is we managed to influence the policy teams to actually look at why is the policy not being enacted on the front line in a way that they had designed it and what are the implications for that. So don't discard the gut of people that have worked in a place for a long time, because they've developed that gut for a lot of reasons. And yes, it might have changed and the gut might be wrong, but it might not have also.
It's more about seeing them alongside each other,
yes,
probably, isn't
triangulation
of
information sources.
Well, I think from a local perspective, I think sometimes the policy person, the delivery manager, and the frontline staff member are the same person, and so yes, that's sometimes where that gets mixed up. But I think there are opportunities to maybe throw the green book at them and say, not literally, obviously, I'm not suggesting that, but at least start to use just suggest a kind of, can we get this down on paper? It's exactly your point, Ben. Can we get this down on paper? Can we start to have a look at this? Can we start to quantify this with a little bit of a logic model? There's plenty of kind of logic models out there, from the really simple to the really complex that we could use. And I think just starting with a very simple, let's get this down on paper, what it is that you're trying to do. Let's see that approach. Let's see that circle of policy to implementation to delivery to impact and outcome. And then, if their view is, it should have this outcome, say, well, where's the evidence for that? Exactly back to your point.
Thanks. We've got another question down here. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Caroline Falani from the National Crime Agency. So I've been really excited by what you've been saying around data sharing, and I've got a question. I'm curious with the answer, and that's, okay, so across government, across the public our systems don't really talk to one another, right? And so the appetite to share data is really there. But then you said something, I think three of you said something around the risk. So in the NCA, we're definitely very much aware of the risk, and we try to be lawfully audacious. We try to have a very positive risk appetite, but the risk of sharing data incorrectly has such serious ramifications. So I'm wondering, in your experiences, especially since the invasion of Ukraine and then certain other geopolitical situations that's happening, what then would be your kind of maybe suggestions to mitigate and safely handle data, share data? Because across government, across public service, we don't really know, unless you've met someone, you don't really know what they're doing and how they can utilise the data that you have, how we can work closer together. But where you're very optimistic about sharing the data, I'm really curious as to how you see us finding solutions to be able to do that.
Right. I like this question because we've kind of said it's more about data sharing, the barriers are more about culture than they are about systems. But actually, there are system issues as well. Our systems not talking to each other. But also there's that element of, in today's climate, how do you make sure you share data safely as well? Whether that's your systems having weaknesses in them, or how do you know you're sharing it with safe people to share it with? Who would like to, Pooja? Do you want to come in on this one?
So one thing I'll say is that risk always needs to be evaluated in the context of benefits. And I always tell people, because now when we're dealing with patient data, even though it is anonymized in line with the Information Commissioner's Office anonymization guidance, it is individual records. And I can never say that it is a zero risk of re-identification. So I said this is a non-zero risk. But a lot of things in life, one could argue everything in life has a risk. It's like, what is the benefit, and does the benefit of sharing this data outweigh the risk? And it is about making the case. And one other thing that has helped us is purpose limitation. So it's not that the data can be used for anything willy-nilly, given to anyone, used for any purpose. That is what people find more scary. But if you say, so for me, I'd say, your data are shared for research that can demonstrate clearly that there is a benefit for public health. There is a research data governance approval and a process that oversees this. It includes lay representation, who they are people who are who are representing your interests. And if you make the case and also have case studies, like when this data has been used before, for example, it has demonstrated when there were concerns that the MMR vaccine was associated with autism, this was the data that was used to demonstrate that there was no link that was seen, and it was for public health benefit. So it comes down to why. Why do you want to share this data? Giving the assurance that there is a clear purpose and there is, like, someone is overseeing that purpose. It is restricted. You will not go beyond those bounds. It's, I think, like Ming said in an earlier session, a red line for us is because the public has said, we don't want our health data being shared by insurance companies. It doesn't matter, even if an academic unit is conducting research, which has public health benefit, but if they're sponsored by an insurance company, that is a red line for us. We are not going there. And that can then help you make that case.
Thanks, Pooja. Sue, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, and actually it's building on your point, Pooja, around purpose. I think that's a really strong thing. If I think about some of the culture, and this is going back to my former role when we ran a thing called Disney, the data sharing network of experts. Everybody had mouse ears. and part of the reason for putting that in place was to help with getting some standardization of approach around looking at data privacy as a useful and proactive thing, rather than P being about protecting and safeguarding and locking the data away. And so as part of that, I and some of my team members would get called into some of the data sharing negotiations, shall we call them, that had got escalated to very senior levels. And I think in most of the cases that we dealt with, it went back to the beginning of that there hadn't been really a conversation about the purpose. That they kind of crossed wires for whatever reason, and also I think compounded by this long-term and long-standing issue of data sharing, stories of, oh, well, that took us 18 months, 24 months, and so therefore a kind of practice had emerged that was, well, we're going to ask for as much as we can, and then we're going to really struggle to articulate the purpose, rather than, I think, what you're advocating for, which I really strongly agree with, is kind of going for that initial purpose. That then helps you to unlock all of the conversations around data privacy, data security, governance and decision making, and kind of, data controller versus processor. But it also then allows you to continue to kind of iterate the conversation. We did that for the vulnerable people service. That was the data sharing component of that for the people who were shielding during that first stage of the pandemic. It was agreements with all local authorities, 5 or 6 big supermarket chains, a couple of wholesalers, and a number of central government departments. But it was done in a really iterative way. We ended up with, I don't know how many versions of different information sharing agreements, but it meant that we were able to progress, and the purpose was really clear all the way through.
And the pandemic was such an interesting time in terms of how we could share data in ways we hadn't ever done before quite quickly. We've got a couple of minutes left, so Neil, and then I'm going to see if
very
Chris
quickly,
and
my
Dan.
nervous tics come back because one of my big data shares that Sue helped out with escalated to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. So, thanks for that. I think you've got a particular problem with NCA as well, and it's about the ethics and the boundaries and all the rest of it. So very quickly, when I was at DFE, I was taken to judicial review more times than I could imagine by the privacy lobby. And one of the things that really helped us was our transparency. So every quarter we published all the data shares that we had been requested for and had done, either both identifiable or unidentifiable. And the two areas we were criticised most often for, and never lost at a judicial review, I'll just put on, was our data shares with DFE and the Department for Work and Pensions, where we were helping people identify fraud and error in the benefit system through educational records, and also some data sharing at individual level that we had with the Home Office to identify where illegal overstayers might be, so that authorities could enact on that. Very sensitive, very similar, I suspect, some of the stuff that you're dealing with. One of the reasons that we never got hammered by judicial review on that one is that we could demonstrate through our transparency publications that we didn't share on every time we were asked for it, and these were the numbers we shared. We had good protocols and audit trails about why we'd agreed on that from the should we, not just the could we side of things.
Thanks. Chris and then Ben, final words, anything you want to add on kind of the security issues, I think, and the systems issues around sharing?
Yeah, well, I mean, data sharing doesn't need to be a kind of, you take the information, there you go, here it is, and they've now got a copy of it. It can be in a secure data environment or something like that that's going to allow people access to the information to allow to interrogate the data, but not necessarily kind of take it out of your system. So NHS Greater Manchester has developed an analytics and data science platform that's basically a secure data environment where people can analyse the information, get the information that they need or the answers that they need, potentially bring in their own information if they need to, and kind of come up with I suppose the policy answer or the delivery answer that they need. So yeah, it doesn't always have to be about you get a copy, you get a copy, you get a copy, like Oprah with the cars. It can be a come to see us and we'll kind of show you.
Thanks. Ben, final words?
I would just say I don't think there are really any technical barriers to data sharing. I think it's just like a myth propagated by people who don't want to share data. And you can just set up an AWS account, put it in an S3 bucket, grant some privileges to someone on that AWS account. Sure, it has some risk for you and it has some risk for them. And on the what if they use the data wrong, I think that's on them. So as long as you're sharing it with appropriate, like civil servants or similar, it's up to them to use that data, right? And AWS and other standard cloud platforms have such good accountability tracking that you can just see if someone does something a bit dodgy with the data, and then there is always that traceability. But just give and kind of trust that person. And then there's the methods to kind of follow up if it does go wrong. And it will sometimes, and that's fine, because otherwise we're all just like stuck in our silos.
Thanks. Ben, are you hanging around for a bit afterwards?
Yeah, can do.
Just if somebody does have a technical issue why they think they can't share data, then they can have a chat.
We actually have an open source. We wrote an open source API creator called RAPID on our GitHub. If you are inclined technically and you want to use it, you're very welcome. It's used by like Starbucks and a few other companies to share their data.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant conversation. I think most of you are around a bit if people do want to grab you and follow up on anything. Please give a round of applause to our panel there.